All right, so we are recording. I apologize, I need to go back a slide. 2 slides. So we left off the other day. We left off on Monday talking about the cardiovascular system, okay? We talked about the heart. We talked about blood, okay? So we've really covered 2 of the 3 big tissues that are going to make up the cardiovascular system. Today we're going to start off with the 3rd one, and that is going to be what we're going to call the vascular system, which is blood vessels, okay? Blood vessels are probably even more important to allowing us to exercise and allowing us to dissipate heat and things than anybody probably realizes, okay? And one of the reasons that we need to understand how blood vessels work, how they control where blood goes, how they help us control blood pressure and things, is that especially on the arterial side of things, it's arteries and arterioles that are going to be dramatically affected by being sedentary, okay? And problems that occur there lead to high blood pressure, lead to coronary artery disease, lead to atherosclerosis, which leads to lots of our cardiovascular system related deaths, okay? So we need to understand how it's supposed to work so that when we do things over here that's going to mess them up, then you guys can appreciate why that is going to be so bad, okay? So when you look at the vascular system, when we look at the vascular tree, if you will, we have blood that leaves the heart, it leaves into arteries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. Veins bring blood back towards the heart, okay? And sitting in between them are going to be these little tiny blood vessels called capillaries, all right? So we're going to talk about the specific function, like why do arteries have a little bit of a different anatomy than veins? Why are they a little bit different than capillaries, etc.? It's all because each one of these types of blood vessels has a specific function, okay? And the needs of that function are going to be met by their somewhat unique structures, okay? So we're going to use the arteries to carry blood away and to pick out to which tissue in your body we're going to send the blood, okay? We're going to use the capillaries because of the way they're set up. The capillaries are going to be the site of where we're going to exchange things between a tissue and the blood, okay? And they have unique structures that allow that to take place very, very easily. And then the venules and the veins are going to be organized and set up to collect all of the blood that's left the capillaries and help us get it back to the heart so that we can rid ourselves of carbon dioxide, rid ourselves of other metabolic waste products, and get oxygen back into that blood, okay? So they're all going to be a little bit different, and that's simply because of the function each of them is going to undertake. All right, so let's start off talking about arteries, okay? Big arteries, the aorta, okay? Even in some ways like your brachial artery. Sorry, I can put my arm out here. I don't know what you guys can see on the TV, but your brachial artery, your femoral artery, these very, very large arteries, okay? They're going to be things that are going to help us in general move a lot of blood. They have very wide diameters comparatively. They're going to help us move large amounts of blood to places, okay? They have some ability to change their diameter to get bigger or smaller in kind of a short period of time. But the really kind of important thing on the artery side is going to be these smaller branches of arteries as they begin to branch off and head down towards individual tissues that we call arterioles, okay? Arterioles are termed resistance vessels. I don't want to give anybody like PTSD if you've had like physics 2 or anything else, but if we talk about the movements of fluids and gases and those kinds of things, resistance in this way, when we're talking about a fluid, resistance means basically how easy or difficult is it for that fluid to move through that particular area, okay? So arterioles being resistance vessels, these are going to be the vessels that will control how easy or how difficult it is to get blood through them into a particular tissue, okay? So the arterioles control primarily where your blood is going in your body. Is it going to go to your stomach? Is it going to go to your small intestine? Is it going to go to skeletal muscle? Is it going to go to your brain, right? Is it going to go to your skin to help you sweat and dissipate heat? Or if we want to do something and make somebody a little bit nervous, we could, ask Taylor to stand up and sing for us, and maybe she's not much of a singer and her face might get a little flushed. We will have opened up the arterioles that lead to the skin of her face, okay? So the reason that the arterioles are going to be the primary resistance vessels is because they have a very, very powerful ability to change their diameter. They can get bigger, which we call vasodilation, or they can get smaller, which we call vasoconstriction, okay? And so the thing that controls how wide or what the diameter of the arterioles are is something called vascular smooth muscle. This is muscle, so if you have your tube that is your arteriole, surrounding the outside of that vessel is going to be this vascular smooth muscle. If that smooth muscle contracts, it will compress and squeeze down the size of that arteriole. As it gets smaller, right, it's going to make it more difficult for blood to flow through it. If that vascular smooth muscle relaxes, then the arteriole is going to get bigger in diameter, and that's going to make it easier for blood to move through there, more blood. So we can control where blood goes in the body by changing the diameter of our arterioles simply by contracting and relaxing the vascular smooth muscle that surrounds them, okay? Okay, so here you can see this is the kind of outer lining. This is the vascular smooth muscle that is surrounding this particular arteriole. And I just want you to note, when you see smooth muscle under a microscope, it does not look striped and nice and tightly organized the way that cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle are, okay? It's not of a huge importance to you guys for the purposes of this class, but smooth muscle is kind of, it's just a hot mess. They just go everywhere, okay? But by doing all of that, then you can get a nice compression on it. And so there are going to be certain neurotransmitters and other kinds of signals that will occur that will tell the vascular smooth muscle in particular tissues to either contract or relax to let us send blood where we want it to go. And this is happening all the time. Okay? So as we look here, what I have is, this is a picture of an arteriolar tree. And so we've got some kind of, imagine there's kind of a larger artery. It's going to come in from here. We've got a primary arteriole like this. And then the primary arterioles will begin to branch off, and they typically branch perpendicular to each other. So this is kind of our bigger primary arteriole. We have a secondary arteriole that's coming off of it, right? It's going to come off like this, and then there's going to be a tertiary arteriole that comes off at 90 degrees, and it keeps branching down like all of that until we reach the smallest arterioles that are going to lead into the capillaries. So we have big arteriole, branch, 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 and then all of these little bitty tiny lines that you see, those are all going to be capillaries. Okay? So when I constrict down on an arteriole, it shuts off the amount of blood that goes into those capillaries, and so now I cannot exchange things nearly as well between the blood and that tissue. Okay? When I widen out the arterioles and I make them bigger, more blood will go through them, more blood will reach those capillaries, and in theory then that's going to increase my chances that we can exchange oxygen and CO2 and nutrients and things as we get. Okay? Does that make sense? You guys with me so far? Yep. Okay. Very good. So when you look at it, I like to think this looks like a little newborn baby, or the Michelin Tire Man. These are the little pictures of the rings of vascular smooth muscle that are around there. My wife and I were commenting this morning that our daughter has lost all of her baby chub now that she's, she's 20 months old today. Aha. Anyway, she was like, she looks so tall and skinny now, like a regular little person. We missed the little kind of chubby baby stage that she was having. But here's the smooth muscle. In this particular slide here, they've taken the smooth muscle and they have dissolved it and they've stained these nerve endings that go to the smooth muscle. Vascular smooth muscle has innervation from the sympathetic nervous system, okay? From the sympathetic nervous system. So it's going to respond to epinephrine and norepinephrine. When you get epinephrine and norepinephrine put in here, it's going to cause the smooth muscle to constrict, okay, to squeeze down. All right, so we'll talk a little bit in a couple of slides kind of overall about how control of blood flow works. But let's move past the arterioles now and let's talk about capillaries. So what you guys see here, this is a capillary. So we have our individual myofibrils, we've got our sarcomeres that you can see out here in our muscle tissue, and then this area here, this is one capillary. The unique thing about capillaries is that they tend to be just wide enough to fit one red blood cell through at a time. That's all that will move through there is just one, okay? Capillaries also look like Swiss cheese. They're very holy. They have lots of holes in them. The pores or holes in capillaries are called fenestrations, and this allows for kind of larger molecules to more easily pass from the capillary into the muscle tissue or from muscle tissue back into the capillary. Okay? At the capillary is where all gas exchange, all oxygen and CO2 exchange between the blood and the muscle tissue is going to take place. Okay? So we have to get blood into the capillaries. The more that gets into the capillaries, then the greater chance that we can have some exchange going on between our tissues and those capillaries. So, and then we've got veins. Okay, so the capillaries are going to all kind of form together and make these smaller vessels that are called venules, and then the venules are going to all run together and make these larger things that are called veins. Okay, the veins are what you can see when you look at your arm or you look at your leg or something like all of that. They're going to bring and collect all of that blood and bring all of it back into the heart. Okay, a couple of other things about veins. Veins do not have the same kind of vascular smooth muscle that arteries do. Veins have a much smaller capacity to kind of change their diameters. Okay? But veins do have these things in them called valves, and the valves prevent backward flow of blood. So once you get blood into the veins, it's not going to back up and go backwards back into the capillaries. And that's good, because that helps us when you've got blood like in the veins in your lower legs to try to only let the blood move, even though it's moving against gravity, to come back up towards your heart. So it has these things, okay? We don't talk a lot about kind of how when you exercise, you contract your muscles, it squishes the veins, and that forces the blood forward kind of towards your heart, okay? And that's going to help with getting more back. That's kind of how veins go. At any one given time, like especially at rest, maybe 60 to 70% of the blood that is out in circulation in your body is in the veins, okay? Blood flow through the veins is slower than it is through the arteries because the pressure is much lower. And so people will sometimes refer to veins as a storage site for blood. And all that means is just that you've got a little more of your total blood volume at any one moment exists in your veins than it is on the arterial or the capillaries. All right, so let's talk about blood distribution. Where is blood in your body normally? And then where does it go when you do certain activities? And so that's going to help us understand then what's happening to the arterioles and the arteries that go to and from particular tissues. Okay, so at rest, okay, blood is pretty much always going to go to the most metabolically active tissues. Okay. Blood is going to contain nutrients and oxygen, which we need to make energy. And so it's going to go to the most metabolically active tissues. So at rest, the most metabolically active tissues in your body very often are going to be the liver and the kidney. So about half of all circulating blood at rest. So if you guys are sitting here in the classroom or you're laying down in bed at home, right? I know some of you probably are laying down in bed at home. Then about half of your blood is going to the liver to be filtered, right? The other half is going to, or the other kind of quarter is going to your kidneys to also be filtered. So we're cleaning the blood, and then we're making urine and removing things that way. So we're kind of keeping bodily homeostasis up and going. At rest, skeletal muscle receives only about 15% of all of the blood. Okay, so not a huge amount going to skeletal muscle. Once we begin to exercise, though, we're going to flip all of this around. As you begin to exercise, much more blood begins to go to your working muscles. Potentially 80% or more of the blood in your body can get sent to skeletal muscle during exercise if we need it to. Okay? So that blood has to go away from some places. So when you begin to exercise, blood stops going to the liver, it stops going to the kidneys. And most of it's then going to go to skeletal muscle. You're always going to have blood going to the heart. You're always going to have blood going to the brain. Those two things are rarely ever going to change. Okay? If they change, we've got problems. All right. So cardiac output and flow to active muscles may be able to go up about 25 times that at rest. So we have this very, very large capacity to redirect blood flow and increase how fast it is flowing by increasing cardiac output, so that we can send a huge amount of blood to our skeletal muscle to provide oxygen, to provide nutrients, to remove carbon dioxide during exercise. Some other conditions that can alter where the blood is going: when you eat, you're going to move blood towards the digestive system. Okay? When you're under heat stress, you're going to move some blood out towards the skin. During exercise, when it's hot outside, we get into this competition between the working muscles and the skin to make sure we're trying to provide enough nutrients and things to our muscles to exercise, while also sending blood to the skin so that we can dissipate enough heat to continue exercise. Okay? And I will tell you guys that if it becomes a competition between the skin and the working muscles, if you're very motivated, the muscles will win, which is one of the reasons that it can be so dangerous to exercise in the heat in people that are really, really motivated. So if you really want to, you can shunt blood away from the skin and kind of fight through your increase in core body temperature. It can be very, very dangerous. Okay, this is just a cartoon that kind of shows all of those same kinds of things. Okay, I'm going to come back to this arterial venous oxygen difference in a couple of slides. Okay? We're going to hit back at this at the kind of end of talking about stuff in the respiratory system. Okay. Any questions so far? Well, we've basically reached kind of the end of the cardiovascular side of anatomy and physiology that I mostly want to address today. We'll come back and clean up the other piece here in a few minutes. Okay. Any questions? Anybody? No, we're good. But Zoom people, I just start like calling out names, and then you just want me to see who's actually here. Just paying attention. Liz, are you doing okay? You got this? Maddie gives me a thumbs up.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, Ellen says yes. All right, I asked Liz. I got no response from Liz. That's not good. Okay.
I'm here.
You're there. Okay. Very good. All right, so now we're going to move from the cardiovascular side of things. We're going to talk about the pulmonary system. So we're going to talk about lungs, okay, and alveoli in the lungs and how we do gas exchange there. So we're going to talk about how we move air into and out of the lungs to bring in oxygen to be able to remove CO2, okay? So lots of books call this the respiratory system. I prefer to call it the pulmonary system. Those things are oftentimes used interchangeably. But what we're talking about in this system is going to be the lungs, okay? The alveolus or the alveoli, which are going to be these small little air sacs that are going to provide this increase in surface area at the end of our bronchial tubes, okay, within the lungs, and then things that are called pulmonary capillaries. So these are going to be these very, very small blood vessels that are going to exist and encircle around the alveoli. Okay? Because the alveoli is going to be where we're going to bring the oxygen in, we're going to put it into the blood at the alveoli, we're going to bring CO2 to the lungs in these capillaries and then put the CO2 from the blood into the alveoli and get ejected back out, right? This particular area, the interface between the alveoli and the pulmonary capillaries, is going to be really, really important. Okay? Really, really important. The general mechanics of breathing, hopefully you guys have seen this and understand. Air moves much like blood is going to move. Air is going to move from areas of higher pressure to areas of lower pressure. And so when you take a breath in, you're going to contract the diaphragm falls. That increases the volume inside of your lungs, which lowers their pressure. As the pressure inside the lungs falls, that pressure becomes lower than the air pressure out in the room. And as long as your nose or your mouth are open, then air will flow in. Okay? When you then want to expire, you are going to, at least at rest, you're going to relax your diaphragm. The diaphragm moves back up. It squishes that volume down inside the lungs, raises the pressure, and that will then help push air out. Okay? So there we go. So that's kind of what all is going on. Now, at rest, the mechanics of breathing tend to be what we would call reasonably passive, right? You contract the diaphragm, you relax the diaphragm, and all of that. Now, if you need to, you can contract additional accessory muscles and further expand the chest cavity and expand the volume of the chest cavity, lower the pressure even more, which will allow more air in. Or if you want to forcibly exhale, you can also contract some accessory muscles and kind of crunch down inside the chest cavity and make that volume even smaller, raising the pressure even more and force more air out. Okay, so as you guys will see in a few slides, if you take one of our other classes, there are ways that we can study and try to understand lung function. It's called spirometry, and we can ask you, we can like look at what's happening at rest, how much air moves during inhalation and exhalation at rest. Then we can have you forcibly inhale, forcibly exhale, hold it for as long as possible, and then based upon what those things look like, it can tell us stuff about how elastic are your lungs, how strong is your diaphragm, like how much air you're actually able to move. People that have asthma or COPD or emphysema or something may have sort of specific impairments that will manifest when you do forced inhalation or forced exhalation. Okay? So we can use spirometry. If anybody has asthma or has ever been tested for asthma, then you may have some remembrance of kind of how spirometry is going to work. Okay, so we've talked about those things. So how do we control breathing? Okay, how do we control breathing? Well, this is the time in class when normally what we would do as a group without our masks on, I would ask everybody to hold their breath for 30 seconds. Okay? Anybody want to do that? Anybody want to be our guinea pig for holding your breath for 30 seconds? Or something? Nobody? All right. So what typically happens when you control breathing, and this to me seems backwards. Okay? What I normally do, we hold our breath, and then we say, like, what happens to your breathing right after you've been holding your breath? And of course, your breathing rate and depth immediately go up after you've been holding your breath. Okay, so the control of breathing, it's actually done in the brain. Okay, it's done in the respiratory centers, which I think are in the hypothalamus, if I'm remembering correctly. But they're going to be motor neurons that are going to innervate the diaphragm. You don't have to think about breathing; it's just going to be there and it happens. Breathing is primarily controlled by the concentration of carbon dioxide in arterial blood, which to me has always seemed kind of a strange thing. Okay? And so you have these chemical changes that are going to be in the body that are going to be sensed by these chemoreceptors. Right? They're really, really sensitive to small changes in concentration of CO2. And they tend to be located in the aortic arch and in the carotid arteries. Okay? So when arterial amounts of CO2 go up, even slightly, and they're detected in the aorta, they're detected in the carotids, as CO2 levels rise, breathing rate goes up. That tells the respiratory centers in the brain to fire those motor neurons. They're going to the diaphragm and things more often. Okay? So when you hold your breath, you are not breathing out any CO2 for some period of time. So you're going to raise the concentration of CO2 in your arteriolar. And that provides the stimulus through those chemoreceptors to the respiratory centers that are going to give you that experience of what it feels like to, I really need to breathe right now. Okay? These chemical signals, okay, are very, very powerful into the respiratory center. You can voluntarily prevent the respiratory center from firing for a little while, okay? If you train yourself maybe 4 or 5 or 6 minutes. But eventually, the CO2 levels become so high, the stimulus in the respiratory centers become so high, you're going to breathe, okay? So little kids want to hold their breath and throw a conniption fit, it's fine. They're going to breathe. They can't, you can't kill yourself by holding your own breath. The problem that also creates, though, is, let's just say that this is one of the reasons that people drown in those kinds of things, is that eventually you cannot hold your breath for super long periods of time. The signal becomes so strong that you will eventually quit. Okay? Now, there are some other things, there are some stretch receptors in the alveoli and in the bronchioles. That as you breathe very, very deeply, they're going to stretch those things out, and it's going to stimulate those stretch receptors, and that's going to increase the rate of breathing in an effort to not stretch them out so far. That's worried about it being overstretched. That might be too much. Okay? And as I said, you can consciously control some of this. If I ask you to hold your breath, you can do that for a little while. If I ask you to hyperventilate, okay? If I ask you to breathe very quickly, and add additional signals on top of what you're getting from the respiratory centers, you can also do that for some period of time. Okay? We're not going to do that because I could ask you to hyperventilate and then lean over like this and change your gravity posture, and we could just tap on your carotids and I can make you pass out. Okay? It's a fun party trick. So we used to do it in the outfield when we were bored at baseball practice when I was in college. Is that you take like 20 really deep kind of over breathing exhalation breaths, and you lean over like this, and you get your head kind of down below your heart, and you just got to just barely squeeze on your carotids, and it messes up the blood pressure and all of those things. Down you go. And you're fine, and you get right back up, and it's not a big deal. But it's, we were young and stupid, and I don't really know why we were doing what we were doing, but we would do those things. So you do have some conscious control. Okay? The amount of air that we bring into the lung every minute is termed ventilation. Okay? Ventilation is the pulmonary analog to cardiac output. Okay? If cardiac output is the amount of blood that flows out of the left ventricle in a minute, ventilation is the amount of air that flows through the lungs in each minute. We abbreviate that as VE. We typically measure VE in liters of air per minute. Ventilation is the product, just like cardiac output is, of respiratory rate, how many breaths per minute are you taking, and then something that we call tidal volume. Okay? Tidal volume is the amount of air that moves into the lung every time you take one breath. So if we know how many breaths you're taking, we know how much air moves each time we breathe, we can multiply those together and we arrive at ventilation. Okay? And so what you see here, these are the results of, in our graph here, this is the results of the spirometry test. And again, we have a spirometer in here somewhere. And if you take exercise testing in prescription class, you'll do spirometer testing, you'll do ventilation testing. But what you can see is here at kind of rest, we've got normal breathings, we have this normal amount of ventilation, right? We then are going to sort of forcibly blow out some extra air here and drive our lung volume down. Regular breaths, you're going to have this big forceful exhalation, right? And so, oh no, wait, I'm sorry, I've gone backwards. This is inspiratory volume. So this is blow out, this is suck in as much as you can. Regular breath, Suck in as much as you can, blow out as much as you can. So there's some different things that we got to know about all of this that I'm not going to require you guys to know. You know, the extra air you can bring in at rest that you don't normally, right, is going to be called inspiratory reserve volume. You have an expiratory reserve volume. You have this thing called functional residual capacity, which is an amount of air that you could blow out if you need to, but you don't. And there's all of these different things can tell us something a little bit different about lung function. Okay? In a normal person, most of this doesn't matter. If you have asthma, if you've got some kind of pulmonary pathology, then each one of these things may help us to diagnose a particular problem. Okay? But you don't have to know any of those for me. I just want you to know what ventilation is and how we calculate it. Okay? Does that seem fair? All right with that? Okay. Pulmonary ventilation, chemoreceptors, blah, 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 blah. So, breathing and increases and decreases in breathing are going to track pretty closely with changes in our cardiovascular parameters. Okay? We didn't talk about this enough, we probably should, but if I ask, Claire, if I ask you to stand up and do something, could you do it? I'm sorry, no, you are reminding me. Hannah. Oh boy, okay, it's been a day. Hannah, if I ask you to stand up and do something, could you? You don't have to, but like you physically could, right? So if we ask Hannah to stand up and do a couple of jumping jacks for us, right? Boom, boom, boom. Your heart rate goes up like that. Like I can tell you, and you're about to have to do jumping jacks, and your heart rate has already gone up. Okay, not the least of which is because Dr. Black is being a jackass and forgot your name. But okay, on those things, but it goes up very, very quickly. Your breathing also goes up very, very quickly. All right. So we call this phase 1 increase in breathing. It's produced by bodily movement. Phase 1 breathing is going to occur with no changes in the chemical environment. Okay. As you first stand up and start to move, you've not made enough extra CO2 to stimulate the respiratory centers. Okay. And so by doing that, we're going to begin to kind of prime the pulmonary system, or we're going to begin to increase breathing in anticipation that there's about to be more CO2 coming that we're going to need to clear out. And we're using more oxygen to bring some in. Once we get up to kind of a reasonable steady state of exercise within a minute or so, there's going to be this more gradual increase and hopefully leveling off. It's going to be induced primarily by our chemoreceptors and the changes in arterial CO2. Maybe some hydrogen will play a role at very, very high intensity levels of exercise. And then post-exercise, you stop doing things, breathing stays up for a little while because cardiovascular function stays up for a little while. It goes up really quickly, but it takes it a few minutes to come back down to baseline because we've got to clear out and regulate temperature and pH and clear out the extra CO2 in our blood. Okay? People that are better trained, that have a better functioning aerobic metabolic system, a better functioning cardiovascular system, their breathing will return back to baseline before other people's, for some minutes of last change. Okay. There are some breathing irregularities. Dyspnea is just a fancy term for being short of breath. This typically is going to result from poor conditioning of your respiratory muscles and an inability to properly adjust to increases in what we call PCO2, which is just CO2 concentrations. Okay? Hyperventilation is the opposite. That's where you overbreathe. Okay? Sometimes people get very anxious and they will hyperventilate. When you do it voluntarily, you can reduce ventilatory drive by decreasing CO2 and hydrogen. If you want to hold your breath longer, you need to hyperventilate first. Hyperventilate, blow off all the extra CO2 that you have, then hold your breath so it will take longer for those CO2 levels to accumulate and stimulate your respiratory centers. The last one is something called Valsalva. You guys heard of Valsalva before? Right? Valsalva tends to be a technique whereby we trap and pressurize air in the lungs to allow us to exert greater force. What it does is it raises intra-abdominal pressure. You contract the diaphragm, right? You kind of squeeze down there, you raise the pressure up, and what that does then is it in essence prevents the lungs from collapsing. So I can do a squat, I can lift some heavy weights, I can do something that's gonna kind of have something in my core that's gonna prevent that kind of high force level from squishing my lungs. It's very often used during heavy lifts and things. The problem with Valsalva is while it is good from preventing collapsing of lungs and things, is that when you Valsalva, it raises your blood pressure very, very dramatically. And so in older individuals, people that have high blood pressure, having them do exercises and things where they require lots of Valsalva can be a little bit more dangerous to them. So you have to adjust things based on that. Okay. I have no idea why the cardiovascular responses to exercise are here after all of this. It's 11:55. Okay. Let's stop here and let's take a 5-minute break, and we'll pick back up at